Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Sabbath. Now, there's probably will make it a lot easier for our event if you don't mind coming down a little bit closer to the front and maybe towards the left side. That way, when the Q&A begins, we will have, it's easier for us to engage. We're close to each other. So my name is Yishen Ma, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Christian Bioethics. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today in person as well as from Zoom. The Center for Christian Bioethics, our purpose is to integrate scholarship in biomedical ethics and clinical ethics with clinical service. That means that we put together many program events like this one where we're trying to bring as much content that is relevant to today's discussion in medical ethics and bioethics to a large audience. We also help to facilitate bioethics events and collaboration across all of the Adventist health systems in North America, as well as church institutions as well. So I want to thank you for supporting our event today and joining us in this sunny Saturday afternoon. So we are very much it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dr. Grace Gao. Dr. Gao is Professor of Ethics in the inaugural Bishop Roy I. Sano Chair in Pacific and Asian American Theology at Claremont School of Theology. She's the author of 2 books and 2 co-edited collections, including Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralistic World in 2011, Asian American Christian Ethics in 2015, and Encountering the Sacred, Feminist Reflections on Women's Lives in 2018. After earning a bachelor's and a master's from Stanford University and a PhD from Harvard University, Dr. Gao has been writing, teaching, and speaking on assorted topics in feminism, progressive Christianity, human rights, and animal relations in Asian America. She is an active member of the Guild, and currently she serves as an associate editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics and as a member of the managing board of the Asian Pacific American Religious Research Initiative, among other activities. Dr. Gao has won 5 teaching awards throughout her 20-year career and is also the first Asian American woman to be tenured and then promoted to full professor at her institution. She identifies as a lay Presbyterian woman and lives in Orange County with her husband, 2 biracial teenage sons, and a pandemic cat. Also, my pleasure to mention that Dr. Gao was my dissertation advisor when I was in graduate school. She's known among students for her professionalism and passion in the classroom. If I'm any good in the classroom, it's because Dr. Gao taught me how to teach.
Oh.
And for her dedication to her students' success in their academic careers. This afternoon, she'll be speaking on her latest book, My Body, Their Baby, A Progressive Christian Vision for Surrogacy. So on behalf of Loma Linda and the Center, welcome, Dr. Gao.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. So Dr. Ma was my former student, one of the most talented people we've actually had in the past couple of years. In fact, his classmates regularly compared his wisdom and intelligence to Aristotle. So this is to say, you are very lucky to have him at this institution. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by talking about 2 anecdotes from my book. So the first comes from pages 59 to 60. It was very late one fall evening. I'd already been in the hospital for 36 hours and counting after having been admitted for a medically indicated induction. My husband had stationed himself behind my head, whispering reassurance. He could sense my alarm at how much my body was involuntarily shivering and shaking from the epidural, IV fluids, and labor hormones. Katie, my friend and intended mother of the baby I had been carrying for 38 and a half weeks, was standing to my left, nervously awaiting what was to unfold. Her husband, Stephen, had not been permitted in the OR given the 2-guest limit. I could see in front of me a large, let's see, I'm having difficulty advancing the slides. Okay. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. I could see in front of me a large curtain and several doctors and nurses scurrying about in surgical scrubs and masks. While months before, I had nearly spit out my drink during office hours when a male grad student recited John 15:13 upon learning of my surrogacy and thus compared me to Jesus. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. It wasn't lost on me that I was now lying down on a T-shaped operating table with my arms outstretched and strapped down in what some nurses have called the crucifix position. Of the many memories I have of the events surrounding my emergency C-section, one stands out above the rest. The moment when my OB-GYN pulled the baby out and we all heard her cry. I remember closing my eyes, releasing a fresh surge of tears from relief, joy, and exhaustion, and thinking silently to myself, hot damn, we did this. I also remember sensing my doctor's hesitation as he held the baby girl and slowly moved toward me. He seemed uncertain, or perhaps he had simply forgotten to whom he should give her, my friend Katie or me, her surrogate. So I quickly exclaimed, Katie, give the baby to Katie, to end his confusion by barking out orders of what was to be done. As my unconventional pregnancy came to an end, so did Katie and Stephen's 10-year saga of involuntary childlessness. All right, the next anecdote is found on pages 1 and 2. In the waning weeks of my 3rd pregnancy, when my shape served as a telltale sign of my condition, I could no longer run into an acquaintance, colleague, or student without having an exchange that went something like this. Wow, Grace, or Dr. Gao, I didn't know you were expecting. When are you due? October 1st. Congrats. Do you know what you're having? Thanks. Yes, it's a girl. But here's the thing. I'm actually carrying my friend's baby, not my own. The eyes of whomever I was talking to would then usually widen with shock. After all, I was then 40 and a married, middle-class Taiwanese American tenured professor with 2 kids. Hardly the stereotype of someone who becomes pregnant for others. How my conversation partners would then respond would vary. Most would pay me some sort of compliment. How generous of you. That's amazing. What a gift. Others would struggle to process what they'd just heard. You mean you're a surrogate? I could tell most were also curious about whether the baby was genetically mine. The answer is no, because I didn't use my own eggs, or how my arrangement even came to be. Many of my women interlocutors would first register surprise like the others, and then imaginatively place themselves in a parallel situation. They would blurt out, wow, I could never do that, before narrating how difficult their pregnancy, labor and delivery, or postpartum experiences have been, or why they just couldn't imagine undergoing all that it takes to birth a child into the world for someone else. Through these exchanges, I even came to learn something I hadn't known previously, how surrogacy had been a live option for some people I knew. 4 women disclosed to me that they too had once contemplated carrying a child for a loved one, but ultimately didn't go through with it for one reason or another. A good friend with a school-aged child and a sad history of miscarriages reacted to my news in partial jest. Grace, I didn't know you were available. And still there are other conversations I could tell you about. My visibly pregnant body and one sentence mention of my carrying a baby for friends had been enough to induct me into a society that I had scarcely known existed. It was one where fertility problems were freely told and shared, and where people found themselves strangely moved upon hearing the scantest of details about our story. Years later, I came to learn that these reactions were par for the course. As Elizabeth Kane, America's first contractually paid surrogate, came to see, infertility isn't exactly cocktail party talk, but as soon as anyone finds out the details of my pregnancy, they feel free to tell me the most intimate details about their lives. So this afternoon, I'd like to share with you my firsthand experiences with and scholarly reflections on a controversial topic. Today, infertility is on the rise, and increasing numbers of same-sex couples are using reproductive technology to become parents. In the decade I carried and delivered my friend's baby, surrogacy rates doubled in the US and grew by an estimated 1,000% according to The Hague. The industry is projected to grow from 14 billion in 2022 to 129 billion by 2032. And Pope Francis has recently called for a global ban on the practice. This is to say that there are pressing legal, religious, and ethical questions about how to think about surrogacy as a path to parenthood. When I first agreed some 8 years ago to carry my friend's baby, I couldn't have imagined that I'd soon be embarking on a scholarly agenda that would preoccupy me for the next several years. But I quickly came to see that there was both considerable interest in surrogacy and widespread concerns and misperceptions about the practice. For some, surrogacy is primarily about celebrities outsourcing their pregnancies because they can. For others, surrogacy is the stuff of dystopian nightmares. And here I want to point out that Kansas Chief Kicker is in my slide. Why? Because he named surrogacy as one of the many evils befalling our life in society today. So as someone who identifies as a feminist and progressive Christian, I wrote my book to engage those who are feminist, but not necessarily Christian, those who are Christian, but not necessarily feminist, and those who, like me, claim both sets of identities. In my vision for surrogacy, we ultimately come to view women or other pregnancy-capable people who bear children for others as persons who are showing reproductive solidarity and generosity. Society neither shames surrogates for their labor nor stigmatizes new parents for involving a third party into their baby-making plans, but accepts that families can be expanded in plural ways, and that motherhood can be shared across persons. So that is, just as maternal multiplicity is already widely tolerated and even embraced in many cultures when everyone knows and respects their place. So I hope we will one day recognize that a child might have a gestational and perhaps even a genetic mother distinguishable from their primary parents. Indeed, we already have historical and contemporary precedents of one lactating woman helping another parent with either low or no milk supply feed their child from her own body's labor. So I would love to see surrogacy become another way where a pregnancy-capable person could embody reproductive generosity in a world where reproductive frustration and oppression are unfortunately all the more common. So all of that is part of my progressive Christian vision. But because I can't possibly compress the argument of my book in this one presentation, I'll just say more about two of the four sources of normativity grounding both my approach and the 7 norms and principles I ultimately construct to guide the formation of ethical surrogacy arrangements. And then I'll address a few common objections. Okay, so of these 4 sources, let's talk first about experience, because experience is a connecting point between Christian ethics and feminist methodology. So following the work of philosophers L.A. Paul and Fiona Woolard, I contend that certain kinds of experiences, namely those of surrogates and of others who have had at least one pregnancy resulting in a live birth, and this is a common surrogacy prerequisite. So I believe these folks' experiences should be regarded as epistemically transformative and thus carry greater normative weight in applied ethical discussions about pregnancy, including pregnancies undertaken for others. So the point is to invite anyone ambivalent about or critical of surrogacy out of concern for the women involved to actually listen to the stories of women who have entered into collaborative reproduction arrangements with others to learn how they actually fared. So indeed, we actually have over 3 decades of cross-cultural studies on women who've become pregnant for others, parent hopefuls who have pursued this method of family expansion, and the surrogate-born children themselves. And I'll discuss some of these findings a bit later. Okay, so in unpacking another source of normativity, tradition, I should state that I, as a Presbyterian laywoman, am not operating out of the Catholic natural law tradition on sex, gender, or family formation. Instead, my point of departure is aligned with several mainline Protestant denominations who already hold that children are an end or good of marriage only for those who have discerned a call to parenthood, that both adoption and the conscientious use of in vitro fertilization, IVF, are valid options for infertile married couples. They are valid options that infertile married couples can pursue, and that same-sex love, covenantal partnerships, and marriage are equally as blessed as their opposite sex counterparts. Again, these are principles that mainline denominations already affirm. So I also stand in the tradition of the Presbyterian Church USA that has never condemned third-party reproduction like some other denominations have, but as early as 1983 encouraged further study on the reliance on surrogates or gamete donors in family building. So in making the feminist and progressive Christian case for the moral permissibility of surrogacy, we must fill the argumentative gap between the acceptable use of IVF between the couple and the acceptable use of IVF involving another person, the gestational surrogate. So the case for same-sex intended parents similarly requires the radical hospitality of a third party, but I argue that it begins elsewhere. It begins by our reflecting on what true marriage equality entails. Because if a same-sex couple desires to parent their own children, another person must necessarily be involved, given the facts of reproductive biology. And since many mainline Protestant denominations already affirm that children are a good or end of marriage for those called to parenting, and that both adoption and IVF are both licit options when straight married couples cannot conceive naturally, it stands to reason that same-sex spouses should be permitted to turn to adoption and use of reprotech as well. Otherwise, these same denominations would be guilty of holding an untenable, separate but equal position. Now, I suspect that many progressives, including those in this audience, share my commitments to marriage equality and to the right and good of queer couples to head families, but maybe still feel ambivalent about surrogacy as a way forward to do so. So what I want to do now is spend the rest of my time addressing 3 popular fears about this method of family expansion. So the first is about the assumed psychological distress surrogates will undergo. The second is about the practice's implications for abortion. And the third is about surrogacy impermissibly commodifying or exploiting vulnerable women. Okay, so the first concern. When I served as my friend's surrogate, hands down, the most common question asked of me by friend and stranger alike was a variation of the following. Aren't you afraid you'll grow attached to the baby and not want to give it up in the end? Even though this child is now 7.5 years old, Many well-intentioned folks have continued to ask me if it's painful for me to see the girl I bore being raised by someone else. And they are always shocked when I gently tell them not at all. So basically, all these folks have assumed that either the post-birth handover would prove traumatizing because any woman would have grown attached to the baby while developing inside of her in utero, or that she would eventually come to feel tremendous loss about separating from that child in the weeks, months, or years after. So what accounts for this widespread belief in deep surrogate pain? One factor must be the belief in the maternal instinct purportedly present in all women, or at least in all expected ones. The understanding that women naturally crave motherhood and will inevitably bond with the life growing inside of them when they are expecting. Just as popular culture commonly characterizes birth mothers in adoption scenarios as grieving mightily and for a prolonged time after being compelled by their tragic circumstances to, quote, give up their child, so it's widely assumed that surrogates would analogously yearn for the baby they let go because of their agreements or contracts. I suspect that just as women who have had abortions are commonly depicted as having made an agonizing decision, even by those who wholeheartedly affirm their legal and moral right to have done so, so it is presumed that anyone who becomes pregnant for others could only sever the maternal-fetal bond with great hardship. That the first well-publicized surrogacy cases in the US and UK ended tragically at a time when the public was first becoming aware of this simultaneously age-old and newer way of having children has further sealed in the public imaginary this belief that motherhood is the commonly desired goal of any pregnancy. In the mid-1980s, the world witnessed traditional surrogate Mary Beth Whitehead's anguished inability to cope following the birth and handover of baby M. Now, across the Atlantic, Kim Cotton, the first traditional surrogate in the UK, was similarly devastated because she never got to meet the anonymous Swedish couple she was recruited to help, and because she had agreed to never contact baby Cotton post-birth. The media headlines about their suffering spurred legislation that in all essence is still intact today in the UK. So surrogacy contracts there remain unenforceable, commercial arrangements are forbidden, and the legal mother is and must be the woman who gives birth until and unless the courts determine 6 to 12 months after that it's in the child's best interest for parentage to be transferred. Popular culture has also reinforced this trope of surrogate grief. I remember watching a story arc in the hit NBC sitcom Friends when Phoebe, a main character, carries triplets for her brother and his wife. So the actress Lisa Kudrow was pregnant in real life, and they just kind of wrote it into the story. At one point, she asks her brother if she can keep one of them. After he declines, Phoebe shares a moment alone with the newborns, saying this: "Everyone said labor was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do, but they were wrong. This is." More recently, Celeste Ng's best-selling 2017 novel, which was adapted for a TV miniseries in 2020, contains a surrogacy gone wrong plot twist. It turns out that one of the two protagonists, Mia Warren, played by actress Kerry Washington, was once a traditional surrogate who couldn't bear the thought of parting with the baby once born, so she lied to the couple that she had miscarried and has been raising her daughter Pearl ever since. So, does surrogacy actually come at a high psychological cost for most women? In contrast to those early tragic court cases and fictional storylines, the surrogacy literature shows that the vast majority of surromoms hand the babies over without incident, distress, or court battles. Though radical feminists opposed to reprotech, defenders of Catholic social teaching on bioethics, conservative evangelicals like Southern Baptists, and other critics have castigated surrogacy for asking too much of a woman, to alienate themselves from what they would normally or naturally feel toward any child they carry in their wombs. Countless surro moms, including me, report never needing to protect themselves from becoming too attached. And so here I have some representative findings from 4 separate studies in Israel, the UK, and Israel, the US, and Thailand. Indeed, an American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology 2021 review essay found the majority of research aimed at exploring surrogates' coping mechanisms during the relinquishment period unequivocally show feelings of joy, accomplishment, pride, and satisfaction. So what the research shows instead is that rather than bonding with fetal life, many surrogates end up bonding with the intended parents. As one British psychologist has seen from her clinical studies, many surrogates and commissioning couples develop a strong bond or friendship because both physical and emotional changes are relevant to both parties. They therefore get to know each other well, and most keep in contact well after the arrangement has terminated. In one of the most beautiful passages I have read about the bond that can form among gestational, genetic, and social mothers, Alexandra Kimball, author of The Seed, Infertility and Feminist Issues, writes about the very intense feelings she felt both toward her newborn and her surrogate moments after the long-awaited birth. And you can read this passage here on my slide. Kimball also says that whenever she sees her baby or interacts with her surrogate or egg donor, she is forever conscious of 2 stories. So in one story, she, quote, had to have other women help me make my baby. How sad. But in the other, quote, she got to have a baby with other women. Pretty cool. So in sum, when we insist upon this trope of surrogate pain, even after numerous studies have found it to be the very rare exception, not the norm, we risk ignoring what the women themselves are telling us. That is, we end up substituting our preconceived notions of what surrogacy is or must be like for women's accounts of their own firsthand experiences. All right, so second concern. A second fear, particularly among feminists, is that the signing of surrogacy contracts would lead to a curtailing of women's rights. When reflecting on Baby M in 1987, and here I have to note that 1987 is obviously post-Roe, but pre-2022 Dobbs overturning Roe, feminist essayist Katha Pollitt noted the way surrogacy could erode women's power and autonomy. So she writes, right now, a man cannot legally control the conduct of a woman pregnant by him. He cannot force her to have an abortion or not have one, to manage her pregnancy and delivery as he thinks best, or to submit to fetal surgery or a C-section. Nor can he sue her if, through what he considers to be negligence, she miscarries or produces a defective baby. A maternity contract could give a man all of those powers except possibly the power to compel abortion. So decades later, a second-wave feminist icon, Gloria Steinem, voiced similar concerns in a 2019 open letter calling upon New York Governor Cuomo not to legalize commercial surrogacy since it undermines women's control over our bodies when their rights over the fetus are greatly curtailed and they lose all rights to the baby. And just for the record, she was not successful. New York dropped its decades-long ban in 2021. So how might we respond to these concerns that surrogacy undermines the philosophical basis for abortion rights, insofar as the embryo or fetus growing inside of a surrogate is widely believed to be separate from the woman, as well as belong to the intended parents? So in an era where there is neither the full realization of reproductive justice, nor the security of an individual's right to pregnancy termination, we must acknowledge that these feminist fears are not unwarranted. We should thus insist upon certain safeguards, particularly the legal right for all pregnant persons, including those who become pregnant for others, to retain medical decision-making in all aspects of their prenatal care, including in decisions about termination or selective reduction. In cases of conflict about managing, continuing on, or terminating a surrogate pregnancy, everyone must remember that the ultimate moral and legal decision maker rests with the prerogative rests with the pregnant person, not the parent hopefuls who have commissioned her. After all, the reproductive justice framework denounces a coerced abortion or coerced fetal reduction just as much as it decries a coerced pregnancy. As philosophers Ruth Walker and Liesel Van Zyl eloquently conclude, sorry, I've got a pop-up window here. The right to decide whether to terminate a pregnancy does not depend on a genetic relationship between mother and fetus, nor is it based on the intention or duty to raise that child. Rather, it is grounded in the right to bodily integrity. Hence, in non-surrogate pregnancies, a woman's spouse or partner does not have a right to demand or prevent abortion, even if he's the genetic and would-be social parent. In the same way, the surrogate's right to decide whether to undergo an abortion is based on her status as a pregnant woman, regardless of the genetic or intended social relationship to the fetus. So it's worth noting that some jurisdictions following guidance from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine have provisions specifically protecting each surrogate's rights on this score. When the law is unclear, clauses in surrogacy contracts covering selective reduction or termination in the US have generally not been interpreted as legally enforceable. Now, Judith Darr, who is the chairman of the ASMRE Ethics Committee, acknowledges this legal gray area, but does not believe a US court would ever direct a surrogate to undergo the procedure without her consent. Okay, so I turn now to the third most popular objection to surrogacy. And so here is the concern is that the industry has created the very conditions for more affluent couples to induce and therein exploit poorer and less educated women to undertake significant medical and psychological risks on their behalf. As buttressed by those tragic 1980s landmark cases in popular culture, the general public still believes that no one would willingly become pregnant with a stranger by artificial insemination or by a more cumbersome IVF and embryo transfer procedure, and then, quote, give up the child unless she were desperate for money, or perhaps even worse, unless she were pathological. So some opponents of commercial surrogacy have bundled their consternation about class with race, particularly when they assume that the parent hopefuls would primarily be white or from developed Western countries, and that the persons they hire would be disproportionately of color or from the global South. For instance, after noting the ways in which the concept of surrogacy, of a person or group taking on the responsibilities that belong to someone else, has been a negative force in African American women's lives throughout all of history, from slavery to the present, pioneering womanist theologian Dolores Williams expressed fears that reproductive surrogacy would inflame already tense race relations between Black and white women. And you can read this passage on my slide. So to be clear, for many critics, the primary concern is not that poor women would be exploited by being underpaid for their reproductive labor. just as poor women are frequently underpaid as housekeepers or garment factory workers. No, it's that payment for reproduction would be introduced at all, which is to say the deeper concern is not exploitation, but it's commodification, right? Okay, and so this combo commodification and exploitation charge has been held by this view has been held by the European Parliament since they passed a non-binding resolution in 2015 supporting the prohibition of commercial surrogacy on the grounds that it undermines the human dignity of the woman to treat her body and its reproductive functions as a commodity. So following Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the Parliament passed a resolution reiterating these concerns and the special plight of Ukrainian surrogates. So now in turning to response, we begin with two frank concessions. And the first is that compensated surrogacies between persons who were previously strangers, it does create conditions not normally present in unremunerated surrogacies between family member or friends. So all you have to do is watch reality TV and you will know that if you give people financial incentives, they will do all kinds of things they would not ordinarily do while minimizing the risk to themselves in pursuit of that prize. Now, fortunately, there's little evidence that the indigent in the US are being recruited to become pregnant for others. And this is because fertility clinics regularly screen out individuals on welfare or public assistance. A known correlation exists between poverty and poor health, rendering underprivileged persons undesirable surrogacy candidates. And because commissioning parents do not want to feel like they must support the surrogate financially. Of course, screening norms will vary from clinic to clinic across global contexts. So what is generally true in the US does not invariably hold elsewhere. And here, the way I've explained it to my students is that being a surrogate is not like being a drug mule. Like to be a successful drug mule, you just have to have a body cavity and the drugs have to be in your body and you have to move from point A to point B. But to be a surrogate and for the intended parents to have a healthy baby at the end, you're not just a body cavity. You have to be in good health. And the only way for you to be in good health, a good uterine environment is for you overall to be in good health, right? So a truly impoverished person is not a good candidate. An intended parent is not going to select you because they want the best outcome possible, a healthy baby, right? So there's a big difference in terms of the drug mule analogy and the surrogate. Okay, so the second session that we must make is that we cannot conclusively verify or put to rest the public's fears that surrogacy perpetuates racial inequities or exacerbates racial tensions. And that's because there are no national or global reporting requirements about demographics, and because many independent arrangements are formed outside of these agency matches and they self-selectively report. That said, in many empirical studies on intrastate surrogacies in several Western contexts, white people are overrepresented on both sides of the collaborative reproduction equation, meaning they are overrepresented as both parent hopefuls and as surrogates, while Black people are largely absent in either role. Thus, racially binary assumptions about mostly white intended parents hiring mostly Black women to bear their children might not only be distorting our perception of the persons normally involved, but also potentially failing to capture other important racial dynamics. So for instance, China is a top sending country in California, has been for many years. And when you ask Chinese couples, they actually prefer to hire white women, right? Not Chinese women. So that reverses the races of what people think is the case in surrogacy. So in my book, I offer more thorough explanations of why surrogate compensation could be judged morally permissible and even good, and thus in women's best interests. So I'm just only going to sketch 4 of these reasons here in the interest of time, and I'd be happy to elaborate upon them during the Q&A, depending on interest. Okay, so the first is tied in an important understanding in feminist ethics that one can simultaneously seek to assist others and serve oneself in the process. Women across the world who undertake pregnancies for others often report a mixture of self and other regarding reasons. They are moved by the pain and sadness of others' struggle with infertility. They find their own identities as mothers important to them. They either enjoy pregnancy or at least don't find it difficult. They believe that they could put the money they would earn to good use, and thus they want to help others become first-time parents as well. So we accept the commingling of self and other regard in other lines of work. For instance, most people believe that public school teachers or nurses should be paid a decent wage and that they might have selected their line of work for several reasons, one being that they enjoy helping others. So why are we so quick to assume that women who are compensated to bear children for others would only or primarily be doing it for profit when we don't feel the same way about public school teachers, nurses, social workers, and so forth? Okay, my second reason is connected to the importance of avoiding paternalism and trusting that all persons can conscientiously and ethically consent to work under risky or hazardous conditions for money. Where, for instance, is the public outcry about the safety and well-being of workers in the logging or commercial fishing industries, given that they consistently rank among the most dangerous jobs in the US as compared to surrogacy, for instance? The Pope Francis did not say, I want to ban commercial fishing, right? He said, I want to ban surrogacy. If one is prepared to say that a poor or working class woman could not reasonably consent to surrogacy because it would only be their lower economic standing or need for money that drove the decision, wouldn't this same critic have to conclude that this same poor or working class woman couldn't reasonably consent to work at any other job either, be it as a maid or a farmer or a meat packer, et cetera, right? So why is surrogacy being singled out? Now, admittedly, in transnational contexts, the records have been mixed. There are some documented cases of the standard of informed consent not being met. So in this anthology pictured here, there have been reports that some surrogates in some parts of India, Mexico, and Nepal nearly always had scheduled C-sections to accommodate the commissioning parents' desire for advanced planning, given their need for cross-border travel. Though these same women were sometimes misleadingly told that the C-sections were in their own personal best interests. So that representation is obviously wrong and objectionable and should end. Still, as post-colonial feminist scholars have repeatedly warned, there are dangers in too quickly assuming that all poor women from the global South are powerless victims in need of aid. Some qualitative researchers who conducted studies in 3 Indian cities, Mumbai, New Delhi, and Chennai, in 2013, 2014, found the majority of their subjects who were previously in wage-paid employment actually preferred surrogacy in their previous jobs. They felt it was better paid, had better working conditions, since working late and reaching home late in their other jobs was frowned upon in their neighborhood and led to harassment or a bad reputation, and might even have been less dangerous than other wage labor available for women in India. So there and others, empirical data fail to sustain the hypothesis that it is an economic non-choice for surrogates. Rather, surrogacy in those contexts thus appeared as a strategic and thoughtful choice to improve living conditions. So moving on, a third reason why surrogate compensation should not invariably be frowned upon is to help parents ameliorate what has been called the tyranny of the gift. This is a phenomenon experienced by some who have received a much needed organ from a living donor who is a family member or friend, and then feel or are made to feel endlessly indebted to them because of it. As per this phenomenon, the gift the recipient has received from the donor is so extraordinary that it is inherently unreciprocal. It has no physical or symbolic equivalent. As a consequence, the giver, the receiver, and the families may find themselves locked in a creditor-debtor vise that binds them to each other in mutually fettering ways. So in my own case, Katie and Stephen, my friends, my parents, took, the parents, I mean, took every opportunity they could while I was going through IVF, pregnant with their child, or recovering postpartum while providing breast milk for their child to shower me with gifts to express their gratitude. I mean, including on the most random minor holidays like Arbor Day, something like that. So being on the receiving end of copious gifts has given me some insight into the real desire some intended parents feel about trying to equalize the exchange so they can feel like the surrogate is not just endlessly giving, but also receiving something substantial from them in return. Okay, so a final reason why compensated surrogacies ought not be prohibited is to meet standards of fairness and justice in contexts where persons involved in other aspects of assisted reproduction are already entitled to receive compensation if they seek it. Here, my point is that the conventional distinction between altruistic and commercial surrogacy is, at the end of the day, totally misleading. Why? Because many compensated surrogates report a combination of self-interested and other regarding motives, as noted previously, but also because uncompensated surrogacies regularly take place inside the commercial landscape of the broader for-profit fertility industry. So in my so-called altruistic or non-remunerated surrogacy, for instance, everyone was paid for their services except for me because I didn't seek it. So the attorneys who drew up our contracts, the psychologist who was hired to evaluate us, and the reproductive endocrinologist and staff at our fertility clinic. Now, if our arrangement had taken place in a context where gamete donors could receive compensation, but surrogates could not, there would obviously be some fairness and justice issues we'd have to sort out. We are now at the conclusion. I have come to see that many people in society not only presume it must be psychologically torturous for women to hand over the child he has carried in a room to others to raise, but actually that they actively want that to be the case, lest their belief in the solidity of maternal love be shaken. As Australia's first intended mother and second known intended mother in the world wisely observed, part of the horror inspired by surrogacy is fear of a world in which the mother-child bond is fragile and transient, a world in which a mother can give away her baby. Surrogacy as a practice threatens public confidence in the naturalness of motherhood and the universality of the maternal instinct. But just as the myth of abortion regret persists, even though countless studies have found that the majority of persons who terminate their pregnancies feel relief after the fact and affirm their decision to have done so many years later, that it was the right decision for them to have made. So I and other surrogates must continue to gently correct people's assumptions about surrogacy coming as a loss for the surrogates themselves. Now, having said all that, there are many ways where a surrogacy arrangement could go horribly wrong. But my hope is that if pursued conscientiously and ethically, as I detail in my book, I give 7 principles, I do assumptions. This is a little not, this is a very obvious plug for milk is basically what I'm saying. I have these principles. So the hope is that if you pursue it, you follow these principles, surrogacy could not only be morally justifiable, but also a thing of beauty. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gao, for that timely and thought-provoking lecture. So now we're entering the second half of our program today, which is going to be, I'm really pleased that we have two excellent respondents who are going to be reflecting on Dr. Gao's lecture. And following that, we're going to have plenty of time for a Q&A. So I invite you to write down your questions and take note of anything that you would like to ask. Also want to do another plug for Dr. Gao's book, My Body, Their Baby, published by Stanford University Press. If you like today's lecture, so we're only scratching the surface of what Dr. Gao skillfully blends personal lived experience with her scholarly research, and a lot of ethical reflections addressing common objections, busting myths. It's a really excellent book. I want to encourage you to order one if you're interested in this topic. So to our two respondents, the first of which is my colleague, Dr. Grace Wee. Dr. Wee is a pediatric critical care physician and a clinical ethicist here at Loma Linda. She's the medical director of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Riverside University Health System, an attending physician at Loma Linda University Children's Hospital, and an assistant professor of pediatrics with the Loma Linda University School of Medicine. Dr. Wee received her medical degree from Loma Linda University School of Medicine in 2004. After that, she completed the combined internal medicine and pediatric residency, pediatric chief residency, and pediatric critical care fellowship in 2012, all at Loma Linda University Health. She has been with the Division of Critical Care Medicine at Loma Linda University Children's Hospital since finishing the fellowship. Dr. Wee is a Loma Linda University Health Clinical Ethics Consultant and also chairs the Bioethics Committee at Riverside University Health System. She has a Master's of Arts in Bioethics from Loma Linda University School of Religion and currently serves as the director of the Center for Christian Bioethics at Loma Linda University Health. Her academic interests include practical philosophy and moral and professional development. I'm very pleased, and you can see Dr. Wee wears many hats. In other words, very much qualified to address the topic today. And our second respondent is Dr. Janice DeWhite, who is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament at the School of Religion, Loma Linda University. She's the author of Woman, a Cultural Narrative Reading of the Hebrew Bible, Baroness Narratives. As a biblical scholar and clergy woman, Dr. DeWhite's research and teaching engage scripture and its intersection with gender, race, economics, and health. She's attended Newbold College for her Bachelor in Divinity, then receiving her Master's of Arts in Old Testament from Andrews University. She received her PhD in the Old Testament from McMaster Divinity College. So also thank you so much for being here. So now we have Dr. Wee.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Gao, for this. That was a wonderful presentation. One of the things that I most enjoyed about it is how you pointed out the falseness of some of our society's common assumptions about pregnancy, motherhood, and women's roles, all of which are indelibly shaped by invisible religious and cultural norms, or maybe not so invisible. By the way, one other little bit of trivia, given the Pope's stance against in vitro fertilization, you might want to check out an article that was published in the May issue of Vanity Fair. It's titled, "The Vatican's Secret Role in the Science of IVF." Apparently, Italian nuns, or more specifically, their urine, were essential in the development of Pergonal, the first fertility drug used to induce ovulation in postmenopausal women. The development of this drug was managed in part by the nephew of Pope Pius XII, who essentially approved of the project as a way to solve what he called the problem of marital infertility. So it's a little ironic that this drug was used in the first successful IVF pregnancy in the US and was used for many years before it was discontinued in the early 2000s. But getting back to our societal assumptions about pregnancy and motherhood. Thank you again for explicitly stating that the narrative of those with a lived experience of the issue at hand needs to be given more normative weight. It's incredibly important to listen to the voices of women who have been surrogate mothers. This experience is epistemically and personally transformative. But I wonder how to incorporate this knowledge that's gained through epistemic transformation within a framework of rational decision making. In my work as a physician and clinical ethicist, I've been taught to seek out information that will apply to the problem at hand. In other words, if it's not a problem, I probably won't spend much time looking for sources of normativity. So we need those who have experienced this difficulty or who have knowledge of epistemic transformation to point out the problems in our decision-making framework. And once a problem has been pointed out, we start to run into issues of integrating the lived experience into the rational decision-making. And we run into these issues individually and also in creating decisional frameworks. So I want to share some thoughts and then correlate it with the narrative of a clinical ethics consultation that we recently had. Now, no one can hope to have experiential knowledge of every single major life experience in which rational decision frameworks must be made. The number of people who can tell of their lived experience is small compared to those who will make decisions that will govern that experience. For example, there must be a way for those who have not experienced surrogate pregnancy to still have access to the knowledge of that experience. And this is usually done through attentive listening to one story or a close reading of the person's narrative. This takes time and intention because there are an infinite number of details that need to be fully comprehended to understand or grasp the vicarious experience. Like pixels in a digital picture, if you miss too many details, the substance of the experience cannot be known. So incorporating experiential knowledge requires intention and time, and this is true of all aspects of a complex experience. No two pregnancies are alike. No two surrogacies are alike. So a heavy reliance on the narrative of those who have lived experience, while absolutely necessary, is also limiting. Now, there are aspects of any experience that are more important for a holistic understanding of the others. And one way to navigate through the limitations of any lived experience is to prioritize knowledge of the crucial elements of an experience. But if you're going to be missing pixels, you'd rather not have the pixels at the edge rather than to miss the pixels in the center of the picture. Because of the time and attention it takes to vicariously learn through another's experience, perhaps we should identify the experiences that are unknowable without the lived experience and separate out them from all the others. We only have so much time, for example, to learn and to pay such particular attention. And so the experiences that we want to probably focus on would be those clustered around those that matters most to us. Those regarding life, death, the ending and the beginnings of life and death, pain and suffering, and yes, pregnancy. So again, thank you for your good work and to help us think about pregnancy in this deep way. All right, now let me get into my comfort zone, which is not philosophy, and let me tell you about a story. So our clinical ethics team was called for a consult for a young woman in her 30s who was toward the end of her second trimester with a surrogate pregnancy. She was following up with her OB when a breast mass was discovered. It was biopsied and the pathology was consistent with cancer. So she was referred to our clinic because of her need for a coordinated higher level of care. And then the clinic reached out to us and said, what was our obligation to our patient to support her decision? She was a single parent raising 2 other children, and the short answer was, oh, we don't know. We eventually settled on an answer that was guided by our legal counsel, namely that her decision was between the patient, the intended parents, and should be guided by their surrogacy contract. But again, the decision was very much within the patient herself. But I mean, although I would agree that that is the correct decision, I would say ethically, this answer left me unsettled. Because I do not think that our ethical obligation ends by essentially telling her to consult her lawyer. But where did our obligation stem from? What would its extent be? I'm not going to tell you I know the answers. I would love to pick your brain about this. But if we frame this question in terms of knowledge gained through lived experience, I think it would be this. What is essential about the lived experience of contractual surrogacy that will help us vicariously grasp and understand the experience? And how would this knowledge guide us towards decision making that is just for all parties involved? When we look at this first part of the question, it's really difficult not to dwell on the concerns that commercial surrogacy commodifies those who can become pregnant. Yes, it is absolutely appropriate to be compensated for work that you find fulfilling. Yes, it is fair to be compensated for one's work. And just because the work being pregnant cannot be easily reduced to its output does not mean we should just throw up our hands and decree that the work must only be altruistic. But I think we're uncomfortable because the commodification of surrogacy risks reducing an experience that is incredibly complex to an uncomfortable bare bones existence. It reduces it to the point where if you put the surrogate's birth side by side to a non-surrogate birth, it might be hard to see them as the same. The essential components are all there: the birth mother, the baby, the excited and proud intended parents. But how come it feels different? Perhaps it's the commodification of the process. If the patient in question had been the intended parent of her pregnancy, in other words, had she not been a surrogate parent, we would not have been asked this question. But the addition of commodification changes the essential nature of the experience. And in the words of Michael Sandel in his book, What Money Can't Buy, quote, treating religious rituals or natural wonders or pregnancy as marketable commodities is a failure of respect. Turning sacred goods into instruments of profit values them in the wrong way, unquote. I added the pregnancy part. While I don't entirely agree with him, I do think Sandel makes a good point that the commodification of surrogacy makes it more apparent what is valued in our society. And that is a little bit uncomfortable. And I think this is essential, though, to rational decision-making around experiences that are epistemically transformative. So what does the commodification of surrogacy tell us about our societal values? Well, why are white American women perceived as better surrogates? Can we not draw conclusions that may reflect an invisible caste system, one that sorts and ranks people for work according to fixed social ideals rather than physiologic ability? What does the commodification of surrogacy tell us about the relative value of the other kinds of work that are often relegated to women, such as caretaking? How is it that a short duration of pregnancy is better compensated compared to the grueling everyday work of caretaking, for example? So, what is essential to the lived experience of contractual surrogacy that would help us ensure justice for this young woman facing a terrible diagnosis? I'm unsure, as I don't think that this is a narrative we have listened closely enough to. But I do know that this woman's experience has, again, exposed troubling assumptions about how our society views work, pregnancy, and the role of women. And it also exposes that women are forced to make sometimes impossible choices because our society has not yet been able to construct a better framework. I hope we're able to do better in the future. Thank you.
The spirit and tenor of Dr. Gao's work emphasizes that experience is a valuable source. And that's the first thing that I want to appreciate about your work, My Body, Their Baby. In biblical scholarship and theological scholarship, the priority is often given to parsing the words, thinking about the historical context, and so many other things that are important. However, experience And I think here of the womanist and Asian American scholarship that Dr. Gao draws on in her work. That experience is valuable, and that the voices of those who engage in these journeys of involuntary childlessness, as well as surrogacy, need to be heard by all of us. My experience that informs my engagement with my body, their baby, that's relevant here is twofold. First, my academic interest and study with reproductive loss over the last several years, looking all the way from the ancient Near Eastern context, Hebrew Bible context. But then second, my experience as a clergywoman, chaplain, who has had the opportunity to journey with those who have navigated various aspects of reproductive loss, including involuntary childlessness. And so these two aspects of my experience have shaped the ways in which I have read this work. One couple whose journey comes to mind were challenged by the weight of what infertility meant to them, particularly as people of faith. Did their inability to procreate mean that they were somehow not worthy? Was there something wrong with their spiritual journey? How do you navigate those questions when such a couple are in an environment where surrogacy is never mentioned? Whether we're talking about casually between other people of faith, or formally from the pulpit and those who teach and lead formally within faith communities. What does it mean to birth a child in such a context? I think Dr. Gao's work here challenges many of us who are part of Christian communities who may not necessarily identify as progressive. And so what do we do as we seek to open up more conversations for those who are journeying through reproductive loss, involuntary childlessness? The mention of maternal love, or the discussion of maternal love, and it being so deeply embedded in our public imaginary, is important in this work. But so also is the understanding of collaborative reproduction. This idea that children are made not only by the person who carries that child. And when I think about this, and as I engage with Dr. Gao's work, I think about historically how common collaborative reproduction has actually been. And we could extend this to thinking about collaborative child rearing as well. This is what intrigues me, and I would like to hear more of Dr. Gao's reflection on this. What it means to be a surrogate mother who is still included and part of the child's life post-birth. I appreciated you highlighting the work of Dr. Renita Weems and Dr. Dolores Williams, as well as other voices that discuss the perceptions of surrogacy, particularly within communities that have sustained systemic violence connected to fertility. And perhaps one consideration that continued to persist in my mind was to contextualize the extremely low rates of Black women in the roles of surrogates and also as commissioning parents or commissioning mothers is acknowledged, or excuse me, is the acknowledgement of the danger of birthing while Black. In other words, Black maternal mortality and infant mortality is still horrifically high and often not given the intellectual and or academic and clinical attention that it desperately needs. And as I read the work, that thought kept persisting in my mind, that is there some correlation as to why, as you rightly mentioned, Dr. Gao, that Black women are hardly represented as surrogates, or should I say as formal surrogates, and as commissioning mothers. I would like to hear more of your thoughts on secret surrogacy. Women who perhaps may not have children or may not be able to have children, and then pretend to be pregnant while engaging the services of another woman who has their baby. And of course, this may be more common in non-Western countries, but still a form of surrogacy. And in these cases, there are specific strategies not to have further engagement or interaction. Now, I bring this up because in your work, you talk about the vision and also the vocation of parenthood. And you frame this in such a way to almost put surrogacy as a way to engage in hospitality and also generosity, charity towards others. And so within your framework, I'm wondering how you interpret then surrogacy arrangements that specifically will stipulate at the end of the birth, there's to be no more engagement or interaction. If surrogacy is a form of someone being able to serve and engage in hospitality and charity, what does it say then if the arrangement specifically stipulates that after the birth, then there can be no more interaction with such a person? And I would be interested about your answer to that in line with what you describe as the tyranny of the gift phenomenon as well. Thank you so much for your work. I could reflect on many things, but to close my response here, I would like to go back to the beginning of your presentation where you talked about the surprise of your students as you would reveal your surrogacy. And you noted that you, as they interpreted you, are hardly a stereotype of someone who carries a baby for others. I would like to hear your more of your reflection on what ways you see your story as unique, given your professional role, but also other intersecting identities that you may have reflected on. In other words, what is it about you and the way that you walk in the world, the way that your students and perhaps other friends have interpreted you that made your story unique? Or perhaps you can even turn that question on its head and say, perhaps you don't see yourself as being a unique person or a unique surrogate mom. Lastly, connected to that, the phrase that you use repeatedly throughout the work, surrogate mom or sorrow mom. I wonder if you have come across any of the data or any of the work where people are troubling that particular phrase.
Yeah.
And so for you, do you feel that, are you using that phrase because you have deliberately, centered on that side of the debate? There are some who would suggest that the mum part of that phrase is very problematic, given some of the things that you've already talked about. And so if you do have any time, I would really appreciate you speaking to that phrase that you've repeatedly used throughout your work. Thank you once again, Dr. Gao, for encouraging and challenging us to not only talk about surrogacy on a theoretical or clinical level, but to proactively seek out and listen to the voices of those who are taking on this role or who are commissioning persons for this role. Thank you.
So fantastic questions and responses by my esteemed colleagues. I unfortunately made the critical mistake of sitting down without my notepad and pen. So I'm going to try to reconstruct, I'm going to try to remember their questions, and I'm going to go in reverse order. What makes me distinctive and unique? In talking to students and people, who were surprised, they universally said, almost to a person, I've never met a surrogate before. So apparently I do not operate in circles where surrogates are just, in their lives. But when I compared, so in that sense, I was distinctive to the people around me. When I did the surrogacy research, I realized I'm actually very similar to the women who bear others' children, meaning I say some of this in the book for reasons that I cannot explain. I do pregnancy very well. I have never thrown up. I don't have stretch marks. I gain weight, I lose weight. It's just not difficult. I'm not saying it's a piece of cake, but it's just not difficult. So I think that's one piece. In the US, I'm also Christian. And in the US, the vast majority of surrogates identify as Christian. What makes me different is in the US, the vast majority of surrogates do not have a full college degree. They've had some college, but not a completed degree, much less a PhD. So I'm in a different education bracket. I ended up saying yes. I narrate the fuller story in the book, but basically, it's tricky saying this because I'm already put on a pedestal for what I did, right? But I do think I have a default. If someone asks something of me that I can provide, if I can genuinely provide it, I would like to say yes. And because I am this kind of freak of nature who does pregnancy very easily, and because I have a job that could give me maternity leave, I had various class protections, I was willing to do it. Okay. To your question about secret surrogacies. So I would like to read more about the particular context that you were talking about. But one of my principles, so I'm not trying to say all of the ethics of surrogacy. I'm trying to give a progressive Christian vision. And one of the Christian values that I really believe in is truth, right? So secrecy and concealment is corrosive of relationship. It's psychologically difficult to maintain the secret. And it's also in an era of, especially if we're talking about traditional surrogacy when it's your egg, in the era where you pay $30, $40 and you take a DNA test and there's a donor sibling register and you can figure out, all your relatives. Secrets they can't be maintained. So there may be particular reasons. I don't want to just, poo-poo it right out. But the surrogacy research also shows that the best psychological outcomes are when the child maintains contact with the surrogate mother, right? And so we have studies in the UK. At this point, we only have studies where the kid is about 20, 25. We don't have them, older than that. And in those studies, the child has maintained contact. And we're talking about some cases where it's already a family member or friend, but other cases where, because in the UK, technically, the UK will say commercial surrogacy is not permitted, but there is still some compensation. It'll take me a while to explain it. But even in cases where they were previously strangers, there is a bond that forms. And the child, usually people make comparisons to adoption and to gamete donation. And the child usually does take an interest in their genetic or gestational or birth mother parents, right? And so for that reason, I support that. There are cases, in fact, there's a book about women who are so pained by their infertility, so sad that they could not have the experience of pregnancy, that they have prosthetic bellies and they match it to their surrogate, and then they have faux trips to the doctor, like they fake the entire thing because infertility is so stigmatizing, right? I would like to live in a world where, if you're infertile, that could be your medical problem. Someone else has a different medical problem, right? It's not particularly stigmatizing. It doesn't get to the core of who you are as a man or a woman or, whatever. Okay, using the language of surrogate mother. I use that, or surromom, because that's how the women identify themselves. They see themselves as surrogates or surrogate mothers, or on the discussion boards, they call themselves surromoms. You're absolutely right that term, so in the medical literature, what I did, not my egg, IVF, then transfer the embryo, I would be called a gestational carrier. So that medical language is correct. It sounds very clinical, I think, to the women themselves who do it, and they themselves think of themselves as surrogate mothers. I think sometimes outsiders who want to distance, no, you're not the mom, I'm the mom, or I'm the dad, they don't want the term mother. But yes, so that's an intentional move on my part to reflect what the women themselves are reporting. Did I catch? Yeah, okay. And just about experience, right? And rational decision-making. So that is the really interesting thing about taking epistemically transformative experiences seriously. Because if you follow, the point is, it actually poses a problem for rational decision-making for the person themselves. Because if you have to make a judgment about whether I'm going to do X, X is become a first-time parent, move out of my family, go to college, go to war, have gender confirmation surgery, something that you couldn't, right? You know that after you do it, or you suspect you will be a changed person. I've gone to war, I've seen things, I've done things, right? You know that you're going to be a changed person afterwards, but you have to make the decision to do it before you've had that experience, right? So it actually poses real challenges, not just for other people, but for yourself, right? So the point is, I want to one up your question to me and to say it's even more complicated than what other people will do with it. It's what you will do with it. And to your clinical case, I think this is, Yishan, is this the same case that you had referenced to me, right? About the surrogate who had a cancerous uterus. Is that the concern? Oh, breast cancer. Okay, right. And if I understood your concern, you ultimately sided with the surrogate's right to medical decision-making. that it was her prerogative, and yet you were left feeling some kind of way about the fact that you can't just turn to a contract, right? So if I can ask, what was missing then? Right.
Yeah, I think what was missing was this feeling of inadequacy. Like this was an inadequate answer to address the problem at hand. And I think it stems from this feeling that a contract essentially it makes a complex interaction a transaction, and you really lose
Yeah.
that relational aspect of it.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So one of my principles I had mentioned, in fact, I have a slide talking about it. Do you see this? Okay. So my principle number 2 is covenant before contract. And I actually end up saying covenant before, covenant during, covenant after, which is to say, ultimately, there should be a deep and close relationship. Ideally, it's impossible to think of every worst case scenario that could arise, but you could think of, life-threatening disease or debilitating disease or something like that. And you would hash out these scenarios. You would come to some understanding, and the contract would merely formalize the agreement. But ultimately, you would do X or you would not do X, not because you've signed a contract saying that you would do X or Y, but because you believe in principles of promise keeping and fidelity and trust, right? So I don't know if that allays the concerns. In my book, I talk about the fact that earlier I just referenced I have this doctorate, but even with my doctorate, even with a husband who's an attorney, there was a time where I was a little bit confused about, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to be following the contract, or am I supposed to be following her agreements, right? So I absolutely agree that in some cases things could get a little bit difficult and muddy, because how could it not be, right? Through this long and certain process. Have I engaged? I think, is there, do you want to follow up? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true if we're talking about the relationship between the surrogate and the intended parents.
Yes.
From our standpoint, we were coming in not having been part of that relationship.
Yeah.
And not having a deep knowledge in what that relationship entailed. And short of getting everybody in a room and sitting them down and having a very in-depth conversation, the contract stands as the shorthand, right,
Yeah.
for that in-depth conversation that you hope will have happened. And so I guess the main concern is that if we take that contract and we find it lacking, well, first of all, are we bound to support?
Okay, so sorry if I can interrupt.
Yes.
So from your perspective as the medical professional, the contract is immaterial. The contract is just between the surrogate and the IPs. You don't even need to know the contents of the contract. You only need to deal with the patient. Your patient is the surrogate. So it might be one thing if you're using the same reproductive endocrinologist, the same fertility clinic in an IVF situation, maybe the IPs, right, harvest, right, they do the IVF process with the same thing. But by the time we get to the surrogate pregnancy, you don't even need to know the contract.
Well, but what if in the normal course of the clinical encounter,
Okay.
recommendations are made.
Yep.
And the patient says, okay, I'm not going to follow the standard recommendations. I want to do this.
Okay.
And again, although absolutely it is the woman's decision, it is absolutely the patient's decision. Often within this patient-physician relationship, we really like to know the reasons why somebody makes a decision
Yeah.
the way
sure.
that they do.
Okay.
And so if this decision is being influenced by these obligations that are outside of the encounter, but nevertheless material to why you are there,
Okay.
I would argue that it is relevant. Also, there is, I think, somewhat justified concern that surrogacy contracts may not all be created equal, right? They may be written in such a way um, as to empower one party over another.
Agreed.
And so
Yeah.
the question to us from the clinical team was, what if we recommend termination and aggressive treatment, but she doesn't choose that. She's wanting to prioritize the surrogacy. Do we have any further obligation to the patient to support her to make a better choice? And if we do, my thinking was, well, where does this obligation stem from? And then what is the extent of the obligation?
That's good. Yeah. So you are dealing with matters that I don't know what's normal. Meaning, if this were not a surrogate pregnancy and just a pregnancy, and she was wanting to do something beyond medical recommendation, I don't know what your normal answer would be.
There would not be an issue. There would not be this consult.
Oh, I see.
There would not be this consult because the assumption would be that a woman who is pregnant with, and she's the intended parent, we always recommend you do what you need to do in order to prioritize your health. The
Yes.
best way to take care of baby is to take care of the mother.
Yes.
So that's what we would absolutely recommend.
Okay.
So I think what makes this different, again, in holding the two up side by side, because right, in our conversation, that was absolutely, I don't know if you remember this, that was actually the discussion. Well, if she weren't a surrogate, then like, why are we
Yeah.
spending so much time about this? I think when we hold the two up side by side, there is a substantial difference because of, for lack of a better word, the commodification of the surrogacy. At least that's what it seems. It's what it felt like.
It feels different because, so in this case, your sense was, were it not for compensation to continue with the pregnancy, they would terminate. And so the money was playing an outsized role in the decision making.
It could. Now, to make, I think, this thought experiment a little less messy, I thought it would maybe easiest just to compare a contractual surrogacy that included commodification, included compensation,
Yeah.
versus a non-surrogate, rather than a surrogate that is done without a payment, for
Yeah.
example.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, is there, to what degree of compensation in a contract, to what degree will it actually have an outsized influence in decision-making, in rational decision-making,
Yeah. Yeah.
that can then be ethically unjust? And how do we take this information and then how do we take that and integrate it into our rational decision-making matrices? Because obviously what we always want to do is take the lived experience and feed it back into our decision-making algorithms so that if we see a problem, we can try to fix it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it doesn't keep occurring.
I think this is an excellent question. I would respond by saying money absolutely could play an undue role, the incentive, but so could family relationships, right? The assumption is, well, in an altruistic case, you're not being induced by this. Well, in fact, it could even be greater, because let's say it's a sister caring for a brother, her gay brother, right? Or now if we're terminating, you're terminating a potential grandchild, right? So I think the question you're asking about pressure right? What is the right one to ask? And I'm not sure how exactly to respond. I mean, I don't think I can give an answer that says, well, if you get to a certain point, then that is undue pressure, but absent of that, it's okay. Only to say that it happens in both cases, right? And this is the problem of third-party reproduction, right? You're introducing a third party, and sure, it's going to be a little bit more complicated. Yeah, thanks for that.
I want to respect Dr. Gao's time. We're a little bit past our planned time. So, but would it be okay if we take
Yes.
1 or 2 questions from the audience? All right.
Just a quick question, and it's perfectly okay if you tell me to go read the book, which I haven't done yet, because you may already have answered this in the book. But one of the things that I would lift up as being a core value of feminism is relationship and connection.
Yes.
And your decision to be a surrogate wasn't just your decision, it had serious impact on your family.
Yes.
So I would love to know what kinds of questions your kids asked you,
Yes.
and how did you navigate this as a decision that has serious impact on your family?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I will say, in this way, I am different than many surrogates in the US. Women surrogates report that their male partners usually had to come around to the idea. They were not enthusiastic. Whereas my husband, who knew that I was very good at pregnancy for whatever reason, and also because we had friends that we love who've suffered so much, he agreed with me that you love people, you want to help them, you can do what you can. So in that sense, husband was on board. Children, we didn't know. They were 6 and 8. We didn't know how they respond. We also knew that they had peers whose parents didn't necessarily want them to know about sex and how babies are made. So we also knew that, okay, we have to explain these to the kids, but then we also have to explain things to their parents, because we're not going to have our kids keep this secret. It turns out that even though we've done, age-appropriate sex ed since a very young age, they still didn't fully understand how babies are made the regular way. And so when we taught them the irregular way, it was like, okay, we used this book called Kangaroo Pouch, and in fact, they were actually very, very proud of the fact that I was helping their friends, because we were part of the same Christian small group, and they had noticed that these friends were the only ones without children. So they had noticed this on their own. My parents, totally not supportive. That was a source of tension. They just, oh my God, it's actually a big source of stress, because they were worried. And my dad, I explained in the book, my dad is a retired surgeon, and his view is you never take unnecessary medical risks. And obviously an IVF pregnancy at the age of 40 is a big risk, right? So they were not at all supportive. But they love me now, of course.
Thank you very much. Just start off with a confession. I'm a progressive Christian who agrees with your basic argumentation.
Yeah.
But I am thinking about why Francis may have said what he did. And of course, there are many reasons what may have gone into that decision. But part of it is the natural law tradition of
Yes.
Catholicism.
Yes.
And I think of how doing things the natural way has a long history, and the vast majority of people are comfortable with that. And surrogacy pregnancy is unusual.
Yes.
Historically, not natural, as most people think of it. And I like the way that you went to principles. I'm more of a principle ethicist than I am otherwise, situational or whatever. But principles take a certain amount of sophistication in applying them. And like you've said, your husband's a lawyer, you're a professor, and you negotiated a bunch of stuff. And at the risk of sounding elitist, I'm wondering, and maybe Janice might comment on this, that if something that might work in a rather advanced Western country works, more or less, we're making it work, would countries that have a very low educational level and a lot of poverty, would something like this be transportable there as easily? Those are just some reflections on this, and I do wonder if Janice might say something about that.
Yeah. So I focused in a few cases on India because India was once upon a time the center of the global surrogacy trade. And in Indian popular culture and in some of these towns and villages where the women are from, even though they had an IVF surrogacy, they were gestational surrogates. No one thinks that because not everyone knows about it scientifically. So they think the surrogate slept with the husband, right? The parent to be, right? So there is a correlation between, do people understand gestational surrogacy and some of the social stigma that women might carry, right? So I think there's that piece. There's also concern in transnational cases. If you write contracts in such a way where the women can't understand them, like if they're literally legal in it, literally written in a language other than the one they're speaking, or with terms that they can't understand, then you haven't made the standard of informed consent, right? So I would address those concerns in those two ways. Was there a...
Quickly, Jim, to your point, I think one of the things that Dr. Gao does well in the book is, engaging the voices of post-colonial scholars and really giving a lot of thought to, while obviously she is speaking about progressive Christians engaging in surrogacy, I think she does a lot of work actually reminding us to not stereotype, voices from the global South and so on. And I think one way that we might do that is by assuming, that many in the global South may not always be intellectually as savvy or able to engage some of these concepts. I think where the abuses in transnational surrogacy, really what's challenging about them is not so much, whether these women are formally educated,
Yeah.
in the ways that we would define that in the West. But really, I think to Dr. Gao's point, are these contracts even in a language, right, that can be accessed? And I think that would be more important to talk about as it relates to informed consent than necessarily engaging questions of formal education.
Yeah.
Which for us to assume that it doesn't come to par all the time, yes, Jim, maybe some people might say would make us more elitist. So, so I would respond that way. But yeah, I think it's a good question.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Gao for being so generous with your time. And that concludes our event today. Thank you so much for coming.